Hello ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sean O'Byrne. I work for the Readings Bookshop. On behalf of the bookshop, on behalf of Black Ink Publishers and on behalf of the Church of All Nations, welcome to this quarterly essay event. I'm just going to quickly hand over to Paul Creasy, who is the Minister of the Church of All Nations, who will give the welcome to country.
Thank you, Sean. I'd like to also welcome everyone here today. And we want to start our time together by acknowledging that we are meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. I hope that we all have a great night. Speaking to Mark and Tony, I think we're in for some stimulating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me briefly introduce both speakers to you. Mark Mckenna is Professor of History at the University of Sydney, author of several books of history, or books of essays on history, including Looking for Blackfellas Point, An Australian History of Place, From the Edge, Australia's Lost Histories, and a biography of a historian, An Eye for Eternity, A Life of Manning Clark. And for those who haven't read that book, I did want to say it's right up there with David Marr's biography of Patrick White as one of the best biographies ever written in this country. And now he's written the new quarterly essay, Moment of Truth, History and Australia's Future. And we're really lucky tonight to have him talking with Tony Birch. Tony Birch is a researcher, teacher, activist and fiction writer. He's Senior Research Fellow at Victoria University and author of several novels, including Ghost River and Blood, and several short story collections, including Father's Day and Common People. Please make both writers welcome here.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Good. Look, I just want to reiterate the acknowledgement of country. I think it's a real privilege to be speaking tonight with Mark Mckenna on Wurundjeri land, and I think in the spirit of Tandarum, which is the spirit of exchange of knowledge, exchange of genuine recognition, I'm sure we're going to have a really stimulating conversation. I am here tonight on behalf of both Readings Bookshop, Australia's best bookshop, probably the world's greatest bookshop, who look after me very well, and of course Black Ink, the quarterly essay. The quarterly essays we know have been running for many years now and are really at the cutting edge of encouraging debate in this country around relevant political and cultural issues. Now Mark has already been introduced formally. Reading this essay of yours, Mark, I think that the first thing I would say is that the literary essay or the critical essay as a form has an important history across the globe in the last 200 years. And when someone writes a good essay, it's an essay that obviously provokes us to think. It provokes us to engage with the sometimes the more difficult but necessary issues of society. And as much as any and better than most essays that I've read, this essay does that exactly. Thanks. We know that the issue of Indigenous recognition, Indigenous self-determination, sovereignty, all the issues that Mark touches on are in some ways contentious and complex issues, and Mark raises those issues in the essay, so it will leave us with a lot to consider and think about. But I think also that what I enjoyed about the essay is that while these issues are complex, there are some simple realities that we needed to consider, and we can consider some of these issues in a much more clear way and not have to be too complex about them. So it's one of the issues that I want to take up for you, because there's a lovely use of language here that is very direct and open to readers. I want to begin shortly after you begin the essay when you mentioned one of the great Yorta Yorta leaders, William Cooper. William Cooper, who was a wonderful Aboriginal man who lived on Ballarat Road or Geelong Road in Footscray, across the road from where I work. In 1934, William Cooper petitioned King George V of England to campaign and agitate for Aboriginal rights. And he used the word explicitly in that about what had been denied Aboriginal people. And he requested as part of that petition that he proposed having a Member of Parliament, being an Aboriginal Member of Parliament. And one of the things that you talk about in relationship to that pivotal moment is a failure to listen and to react to those intelligent demands of Cooper. And I think that one of the issues that resonates throughout the essay as you deal with history is that it does seem one of the repeated failures of Australian society and Australian government, the repeated failures of listening adequately and failing to respond. I'd like to begin with that general premise of why do you think this is so, and what are the ramifications of this deafness?
Thanks, Tony, and hello everyone, and thanks for coming along tonight. That's a great way of starting, Tony. I guess for me, one of the defining moments of recent Australian history was not only the delivery of the Uluru Statement, but the rejection of the Uluru Statement. For two reasons. So, firstly, because of how it was rejected, in that there were false claims about the advisory body being a third chamber of Parliament, which it clearly wasn't. But moreover, because of the manner in which this was done, which I think said a lot about our failure to listen, as you say, Tony. Rather than an address to the nation or an acknowledgement by our Prime Minister that this process of the Uluru Statement and the Referendum Council's report had gone through months and a long process, years of consultation and dialogue, rather than acknowledging that by a formal delivery of a Prime Ministerial statement in public, it was rejected through the release of, in a way that any other run-of-the-mill political issue would be rejected, which is just issue a press release. And thirdly, the complete absence of acknowledgement of the demand for a truth-telling commission as an essential, a makarata, as an essential component of what was being asked for here. First thing that was being asked for was an Indigenous advisory body to Parliament, which would be constitutionally enshrined. That means its existence would be enshrined in the Constitution, not its workings. Its workings would be subject to Parliament. And second, a makarata, which would supervise treaty making and also supervise truth-telling. Now, there was no mention in the government's press release of truth-telling. So the way in which this took place, to me, was a defining moment for us as a nation. And being optimistic, even in this moment of denial, because in a way the Turnbull government's the way it responded was itself an expression of the core problem in the way that governments historically have failed to negotiate with Indigenous Australians as equals. We don't have a culture in Australia of treaty making at a federal level. We're starting to, and I'm happy to talk about the state level process if we want to, but we're starting to do that at a state level. But we don't have a history of treaty making, and I think that showed in the way that Turnbull responded to this state. So it was very expressive of our failure historically, the way in which this was done. But as I said, as an optimist, it actually might achieve something unintended, which is a kind of crystallising of a deeper understanding now, because of its rejection, of its importance, of its centrality. So that's one of the things I'm grappling with and writing about in the essay.
One of the other things that interested me is that you begin with a reading of the landscape. So you talk about Canberra,
Yep.
and you go back to the so-called birth of the capital, and again the refusal to recognise an Indigenous presence there. I just want to quote and then ask you a question, which again is to broaden that notion out. So you write, "Yet today, if one scans the monumental landscape of Canberra's parliamentary triangle, there is no acknowledgement that such events ever took place," referring to issues of colonial violence. "The nation simply rises unencumbered from the ground." So another point here that struck me, and I've done a lot of work on erasure of place, is that you seem to reiterate also that landscape and country is always manipulated to hide or mask the realities that we need to confront to in any way consider ourselves a mature nation. It's relative also, of course, to you talking about your place, where you live, and having to reconsider your place in place by saying, well, this in fact is an Aboriginal place. So that attempt at forgetting or erasure there, it's a very self-conscious proactive act. It's not simply passive amnesia, is it?
No, definitely not. And in fact, we've all, I take it, been to Canberra. Perhaps some of us have even lived there, like myself. And if there's any place, any space in Australia that is manipulated, it's that parliamentary triangle. I mean, its task, its challenge is to define, to make a statement about who we are as a nation. And as I wandered around those vast empty spaces in the parliamentary triangle, it became really clear to me that that parliamentary triangle itself is another example of how we failed Indigenous Australians. In that, if you look at that space, there's a tent embassy which is not invited, and there's an easily missed reconciliation place with very, very easily missed. Otherwise, there's no Indigenous presence in that parliamentary triangle. And this, you know, imagine coming to this country from overseas. Imagine how, when you're a tourist, you're obviously you're reading the landscape perhaps in a different way or more self-conscious way than you might do at home. And what conclusions would people come to? Where is the Indigenous presence? Its absence speaks volumes. So, and I guess a lot of my work recently, for some time, I guess more than a decade now, has been anchored in place. So I often start in a small place, and the places are actually getting smaller as time goes forward. But I really love burrowing down into the details, the whole the sensory dimensions, the historical, every aspect of a place, and seeing how that sort of resonates and ripples and what it says about the larger whole. And I think I've been doing that for some time, which is why in this essay, as you said, I talk about where I guess I began writing Aboriginal history through buying property on the South Coast.
Now, I did warn Mark of this question. It's one that I can never answer, that I mull over quite often. So you're highly critical of Turnbull's response to the Uluru from the Heart statement. That's clear, and I think rightly so. I often despair at leadership, but there are times when I want it desperately, so that because I work in climate change and climate justice, you know, climate denialists are wreaking havoc out there in communities who need, you know, informed knowledge. I think a lot of people would suggest that in the last probably couple of decades in Australia, there's been a real absence of what we might call ethical and moral leadership at a political level. To what extent do you think that we need it for this? This is a huge issue. For this issue to move forward, to what extent do we need leadership that can deal with this issue in a mature way? Or, in combination with that, to what extent can we drag politicians kicking and screaming to a more informed position? Well,
For this issue, for the resolution of this issue, which after all, you know, we've been working through, if I can just, this is important, I think, to give a sense of the scale of how long we've been grappling with this problem as a nation. You know, I, like many people here, I lived through the 1980s, the decade-long debate over invasion or settlement, lived through the question about the apology or not to apologise or not to apologise, the history wars, the recent polarised debates over colonial statues and Australia Day. So this has been an ongoing, constant difficulty for us to work through, and we still haven't managed to do that. So leadership, political leadership, to your question, you know, it's central. Without it, we won't be able to get there. But I'll say this much. Indigenous affairs are at least the kind of reconciliation angle, and that's a word we could also talk about. It's purchase now. Indigenous affairs has been largely conducted through a dream, if you like, of bipartisanship since the Council of Aboriginal Reconciliation was founded in 1991 with bipartisan support. And as you know, with recognition, it's also been spoken of as something that has to take place, can only be achieved through bipartisanship. Now, we know that Indigenous leaders, Pearson and others, have said since the rejection of the Uluru Statement that bipartisanship is dead, that era is over. You might recall that Turnbull actually, in response to Shorten recently said that he would basically put an advisory body into action as a form of trial to see how it worked before it was actually enshrined in the Constitution and settled. So Turnbull's response was, let's make it an election issue. And we know what that's code for, potentially. Perhaps it's code for race. And that's but on the other hand, perhaps this is the battle we have to have. Perhaps we have to forego that illusion of complete bipartisanship, and we have to fight this out in that way. I point in the essay to the example of the same-sex marriage survey, in that eventually that issue was resolved by marginalising a rump in, the rump was of course larger in the Conservative parties, but you have to at some point push this issue forward to some form of resolution. And we haven't had the obvious example, which people keep bringing up when we talk about leadership, or the lack of leadership today, is Keating. He's the first word that comes to mind because he was clearly someone who had a point of view on take whatever issue, but went forward, persuaded, advocated, passionately, determinedly. We don't have that. We haven't seen that. That's what's missing. Politically, there's a reality at the moment that the government's majority is very thin, of course. That simple fact of political
I'm not offering excuses
uncertainty, but it makes it harder. Especially as we know, recently, for example, when he made a comment on the Republic, I think it was New Year's Day, and he dared to speculate that if the Queen died, maybe we could use the same method of resolution. We could use a survey to determine how we should elect the head of state. And of course, within 24 hours, he'd retracted and withdrawn, and people had banged the usual drums in the party, and he'd stopped saying anything. So there's a sense of kind of a complete lack of courage and vision.
It's interesting because, you rightly go back to Keating's Redfern speech of 1992. One of the unfortunate circumstances in the post-Keating era, and I think there's a pivotal moment, which is John Howard's Thomas Playford's speech in 1996, where he brings up this notion of a relaxed and comfortable view of history and sort of kicks off the history wars. It's interesting when we think now 20 years and a bit onward, it seems that unfortunately the legacy of Howard seems to be at the moment more dominant than the legacy of someone like Keating. Because what seems to be resonating, and I was going to ask that question when you mentioned just now where Turnbull said he could make it an election issue, clearly saying this, it will turn this into a wedge hot button issue in a very shallow way. So it seems to be that the state of national politics, certainly within Conservatives at the moment, reflects that what I would have regarded as a very self-conscious attempt by Howard to manipulate the community.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic than that. I think that given the fact that we've had so much literature, both history, fiction, film, documentaries, so much work produced on the true history of this country's foundation. for over 50 years now, that is a body of evidence, it's a body of insight and understanding that has had a cumulative effect. I think that, in the essay I quote Keating's Redfern Park speech briefly. We took the children away from their families, we committed the murders, we brought the diseases. You know the speech. And then quote Howard, more than a decade later, saying Australia was founded without any conflict at all. How could these two completely contradictory statements from two prime ministers, how do we explain that? And one of the byproducts of this long period of divisive debate and partisan debate about history, politicised, is that we've lived with competing visions of the nation's historical foundation. We've lived with these contradictory, competing visions. And the Uluru Statement and the possibility of a truth-telling commission offers a way through this, I think, as I'm trying to argue in the essay. It offers an opportunity for us to, and this comes through, in the Referendum Council's report, right, which remarkably, all the focus went onto the advisory body. But the Truth-Telling Commission is a big part of that Referendum Council report. And they make very clear that in the dialogues, in the process that took so many months all around the country, Aboriginal people over and over again stood up and said, we want you, non-Indigenous Australia, to listen to us tell our experience of this history. We've heard historians speak about it, usually non-Indigenous historians, but now we want you to listen to us. So, and this was coming through in regions, in cities and towns, all the way through that dialogue process. And that's the kind of bedrock of the recommendation for a truth-telling commission. It's that dialogue process and what Aboriginal people around the country asked us to do, which I don't think we haven't heard. We haven't really listened. We haven't heard. And that's again going back to the start of the essay that you quoted, that in a way the whole essay is a kind of a long attempt to ask people to stop and think and understand how and why we haven't listened and haven't heard, and to actually change that.
I want to come back to the Uluru Statement in a moment, but also I want to test your optimism a little further by quoting Tom Griffith.
Oh yes, please do.
So Tom, who we both know, and Tom's a wonderful historian and geographer. Tom Griffith talks about the endemic forgetfulness of dominant culture. Little of the new history has permeated broader public consciousness. The knowledge does not stick. So I agree with you entirely that since 96, there is a lot more material, there is a lot more stuff available to us to be more informed about colonialism, shared past, separate past, etc. But Tom's point about knowledge does not stick.
Yeah.
To what extent are you confident that we can get people actually to stay with this story rather than... A really good example of this would be if we look at symbolic moments, which I think both matter and can be problematic, is that from where I'm coming from, you often get great moments of symbolism, like the apology, like the Redfern speech, but the momentum can quickly dissipate. And the critics of Aboriginal people will say things, what do you want next? As if these symbolic moments themselves delivered something of substance. Now, they weren't supposed to, that's not the criticism of them, but in other words, dare we talk about cricket? We were talking about it outside, but, and you're critical of the dominance of the Anzac mythology. There are certain stories that stick so hard you couldn't get rid of them with a good scour.
No, it's good.
So
I'm glad you mentioned the
we
cricket.
need traction for people
yeah.
to live with these stories and in a way to own them and see them as stories of shared responsibility.
No, good point. I did lose one interview this morning because of the cricket.
Yeah. Well, you're not losing
cricket,
this one.
the crisis around the,
You have your tragedies after.
the cricket team is the pillar of Australian society, I heard someone say today. Yes, why doesn't the knowledge stick? Tom's quote. It sticks and then it's forgotten and it has to be out. Yeah, very good question. Again, I would say this is, if we take we know, as I said earlier, the Victorian government, for example, is on Wednesday, legislation will be put to Parliament to enshrine in legislation a representative body for Victorian Aboriginal people to negotiate with the Victorian government about the signing of treaties. Okay? The South Australian government was, before the election, thinking of doing something similar, but significantly the new government that's come in has said that treaties are, quote, a cruel hoax. So they depend on who's in government. So there's a lot of hopeful signs at a state level. But I'm one who believes, and this goes back to the Uluru Statement where we began, that there's a particular galvanising potential about federal government, that only the federal government has the capacity to shift, to make that knowledge stick in a way that hasn't happened before. Take the Canberra example we talked about. Take the failure of, as many people have pointed out, of the state to sanction a memorial to the frontier wars. There is no such state-sanctioned memorial. All of this points to an urgent need for the federal government to realise, this goes back to leadership, to realise its singular galvanising potential to shift the nation's sense of itself in a way that we still wait to see. So that truth-telling commission on a national stage would have a profound, potentially profound effect to make that knowledge stick. I would say.
Okay, so there's an elephant in the room, in the essay and in the room. One of the things that, thinking about the essay and now thinking as an activist, now you do mention the Tent Embassy's presence in that triangle in Canberra. You mentioned the Invasion Day rallies. Well, certainly the one in Melbourne here was the biggest in Australia. We had about 50,000 people. I spoke at that. If you look at the agitation against Australia Day at Darebin Council, Yarra Council, yep. I don't know who desecrated the statues. There are various culprits out there. But there is another issue, and that for whether people are comfortable with this or not, there is division within the Aboriginal community about recognition. Yeah. So from our perspective, being usual troublemakers from Victoria and southeastern Australia, there's a lot of, a lack of faith in the fact that constitutional reform or recognition does not become simply another symbolic and hollow gesture. So now, I'm not saying that will occur, but clearly one of the frustrations coming from Victoria is that our opposition to some of the ways that the debate has gone is that not only do I think some voices in the Aboriginal community get marginalised, but I think for a big issue for all of us, and I'm interested, this is an add-on, is I think a process of patience rather than something that we rush through, is that it seems absolutely right and appropriate that in fact that various voices within what we might otherwise call Aboriginal Australia are able to partake in a debate of which there will be a period also of friction. Because you talk about, there's a necessary debate we have to have which may be anguish, which may be difficult. I think there's another debate, and that is that rather than try and rush through it or produce a sense of uncomplicated bipartisanship within Aboriginal Australia, we have to accept that equally there is a more informed discussion that needs to take place which will actually take time. So I think one of the things that a lot of Aboriginal people in Victoria would say is we need to deal with this with adequate time. And it seems that non-Aboriginal Australia finds it difficult to deal with, which can be intellectual differences.
Yeah, I mean, I think one can, of course, understand why the scepticism of many Aboriginal people about the capacity of an advisory body. You know, some Aboriginal leaders, as you know, said this was going cap in hand to government. If you look at and saying, please let us advise you, and I think that was probably a bit harsh in the sense that the actual way the advisory body will work on the ground is to be worked out, is to be negotiated. So it's too early to make judgments about its working. It's got a capacity to actually, I think, seriously involve Indigenous Australians in framing and implementing policy that affects their lives. That's its potential. So I understand that frustration. If you look historically, of course, you know, they would have good reason to be sceptical. And the sense of time, patience, you know, I mean, you can find Aboriginal people saying, we've been, how many, at the moment, the issue's gone back to a committee, another committee, the fifth, I think, in the space of 5 or 6 years. They're exasperated with the lack of progress. 1967 is the last substantive constitutional change. 50 years, more than 50 years ago, and still we wait. So there's a sense of impatience as well that's there, and an impatience, or if you think of that 5-decade period of waiting, extraordinary patience on their part to be still sitting and waiting and hoping that the government will actually listen to what came out of that process.
Yeah, I think, I mean, clearly there's an enormous sense of, frustration. I think though it's what sort of talk we're having that can be the problem. So that it's very similar, I think, to some of the issues around climate, is that we have a sense of urgency, but that urgency is predicated on a committee that has a delivery date, so it becomes bureaucratic and institutionalised, so that the outcome then, it's like something that went round the circle. So that the impatience comes that, well, we actually didn't move forward. So my interest is, and you certainly don't have to answer this, but maybe thinking here as a member of a group of interested and informed people, I actually do think it's the sort of conversations you have. I had a friend, for instance, who I thought put up a really remarkable proposal for what he called treaty circles. And they were, and I know that there's a climate group who runs some of these similar out in the community, and that was literally to go out into local communities and have gatherings like this where you talk about, well, what does a treaty mean? And I know this is done at some official levels around recognition, but in a way a broader sense of that knock-on effect of knowledge.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on, Mark.
No, I just want to pick up on one word you mentioned, custodianship, and the land. I mean, one of the elders, Ozzie Cruz, who's a local elder in the area I live on, the far south coast of New South Wales, I sat with him and talked to him while I was writing the essay, and one of the points he made about custodianship, he said, you white fellas, you always want to say, we'll look after the black fellas' custodianship, original custodians of the land. That we'll look after the land. He said, no, think about equal custodianship. Think about what you can learn from us and how we can both share that custodianship. And I thought that was a really important point about the way we might frame that in a constitutional sense, and also express that itself would be an expression that we had learned something, I think.
I mean, that's a relevant point. I'm just going to ask 2 more questions, by the way, and then we're going to open up to the floor. But the first one was relative to that. One of the parallels that I found in this essay with my own work goes to that very point. So if I can quote you again,
Sure.
You say, when we speak, and you've mentioned it, when we speak of a culture of forgetting in Australia, it's forgetting of a whole culture, a whole way of seeing land. Aboriginal people had a name for every plant, creature and landform in the continent. So I've reflected on this a lot in the work that I'm doing, because clearly one of the issues around climate justice and climate change is that there is a massive body of knowledge, cultural and scientific knowledge out there. There's absolutely necessary for us as a nation to deal with another vital issue. And there is, by the way, some very, very good work being done in local communities with scientists, with environmentalists, ecologists. But I think, again, one of the knock-on effects of getting this other question right that you're concerned with in this essay would be, in fact, it creates a more informed situation to deal with other issues, such as climate justice. So that was a point I wanted to make. I want to quote Mick Dodson and to ask a last question based on a reflection of a friend of mine who you may know. I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't know him. But so just a quote from Mick Dodson: "There is something in the Australian psyche that goes back to colonisation, and there is a fear of facing up to the truth." When I was at the Sydney Writers' Festival a couple of years ago, a really good friend of mine, Bruce Pascoe, who's written a remarkable book called Dark Emu around Aboriginal ecologies and agriculture, we were talking, it's a little bit like the Tom Griffith, can you get knowledge to stick? Bruce, if people have worked with Bruce at all, he's a wonderfully engaged man, and he's the very person who looks to getting people to work cooperatively. Bruce says he doesn't think white Australia can do remorse in a proper way. And what he meant by that was not to be disrespectful, say, yes, you can have moments like the response to the national apology where people, are very emotional about what they witnessed and very apologetic, but he thinks even that can dissipate quickly. It's like, is that right or wrong? I just wonder how you feel about that in relationship to what we might call the Australian psyche and the ability to recognise wrong, the ability to adequately deal with the responsibility of having done wrong, and seeing that as as productive rather than negative.
Exactly, productive.
Exactly.
To see it as productive, not to be fearful, not to see it as a condemnation of the nation's entire history, but to see it as potentially liberating, potentially productive. I mean, that is, even the apology was framed in a way as saying, now we can move on. And the great danger, as you know, with this kind of symbolic acknowledgement is that moving on becomes code for turning away, leaving behind. And the challenge posed by this Truth-Telling Commission is that paradox that you're getting to, that acknowledging this history has to be done in a way in which we bring it with us, that it becomes part of the way in which we think and express who we are, as opposed to leaving behind, moving on, turning away. That's the challenge. And that challenge for me is not just there in recognition, okay? As someone who's, written and advocated for an Australian Republic for a long time, the great failing of the Republican movement in Australia is that it's pretended, it's believed, that we could prosecute the idea of a republic without needing to even think or refer to Indigenous Australia. That somehow the republic was just all about Britain, that it was all about the monarchy, and that we'd become more independent by severing that last tie. So all of that time, the Republican movement has been looking outwards, pretending that we could become independent just through breaking away from Britain, and not looking within, and not connecting the very challenge that we face with truth-telling, with recognition and constitutional reform with Indigenous Australia as actually the core rationale, the first reason to be a Republican. Malcolm Turnbull became a Republican in 1988 when he stood at Sydney Cove and listened to Prince Charles give the main address. And he was offended. What is this royal man giving the main address for? Well, what else was happening on the streets of Sydney on the 26th of January 1988? Huge protests about that very question of invasion, but Turnbull's patriotism The whole idea of a republic is looking towards Prince Charles. Irrelevant. And that's a realisation I think that we haven't yet, that Republicans have to still have to make.
Thank you, Mark. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take questions from the floor. You're going to keep your questions succinct and to the point. You can send the mission statements to Mark by email, and we're not taking any questions on the cricket. So who would like to kick off? See, the cricket man's gone. Who would like to kick off with a question?
Stay there.
Thank you, Mike.
I sent a report about this essay to Greg. I think it's one of the best supporting essays I've read. But I have received just half an hour ago a note from the Australian Republican Movement Victorian group saying we are invited to join fellow supporters of an Australian head of state and international directory by concluding on the Republic Movement's plan for 2018 on 6 o'clock on Wednesday night. So, what do I say? What do I say?
I'm sorry, I just didn't understand. So this comes from the Victorian ARM, and they have said that...
They're having an event on Wednesday night at 6 o'clock where Michael Coon, the National
It's
going to tell us about the ARM's plans for this year. Now, it's all about a new Australian head of state. Obviously, I have to say something to him about your quarterly essay. What do you want me to say?
More than that, you have to take a whole pot. No, I mean, for all the members of the Republican movement, I think, what do you say? Well, have you read this? But look, it's the head of state, you know. One of the misconceptions that is sort of created by this constant focus that a republic is just about the head of state. I mean, ask ourselves, is it the head of state who will be sovereign? Let's hope not. So a republic, head of state is one aspect of a move to a republic. And again, that emphasis on the head of state pushes the whole debate to, you know, Queen as head of state versus Australian for head of state, where you end up with crude slogans like a mate for head of state, or that's been ditched now, but it was seriously proposed. So we have to push away from that focus on the head of state. It's what was tried in the 90s and failed. Minimalism. It's no longer enough. It's a language that was tried and failed, and it's not appropriate for this moment in time. It's not going to work. So they have to seriously rethink. You know, the Republican movement has traditionally just believed these two things move on different tracks. And Bill Shorten and others are now starting to put them in the same breath. There is a shift. It's starting. And I could list people like Megan Davis and others who've also started to suggest that a republic has to first address the issue of recognition, and Republicans have to speak about that, not just about the head of state.
I mean, just a couple of quick points. I mean, one of the things you brought up was the same-sex survey, and I have 5 kids, and they're quite young, in their 20s, so they cost me a lot every day. One of the things is they were really heavily invested in the issue, and they saw it as a fundamental human right. If I go home tonight and say to my 20-year-old, you know, what do you think about the Republic? She'll put, Married at First Sight on or something.
Yeah, sure.
Not to sex it up, but how can we make, one, the Republican movement as relevant to you, because you see it as a very important issue, one, and two, for younger Aboriginal people who would say, well, what is beyond recognition, or what might come with that? And again, not as saying we're against it, but what would come beyond what could be otherwise seen as a symbolic moment? Who are looking for something, again, tangible.
Yeah, well, you know, it's entirely rational for your daughter, was it, or son?
Yeah.
To
She
respond
is occasionally
in
rational.
that way. Because the rationale for the change to a republic is expressed like this. Don't worry, it won't change anything. You should vote for it. That is the rationale. It's all right. It won't change anything. Everything will stay the same. Please vote for it. Yawn, yawn. So instead of saying nothing will change, first point, start addressing the real issues that are relevant to constitutional change. Start addressing those. Start standing up and talking about the things we've been talking about tonight, instead of talking about whether Prince Charles will become king or whether Camilla will be there with him, or that's totally irrelevant. We can still dabble in all of that like the Americans when we're a republic. It's irrelevant. It's not. So it's a huge shift that's required. And yeah, I'll stop there.
But what would be beyond recognition other than another act of symbolism? If that's, and to me that's a valid.
Well,
criticism.
the core point of the whole, to me, the core point of the proposition of the advisory body is no, we don't want, we're tired of, this is not the 1990s, we don't want a coffee table statement in a preamble with a non-justiciable clause which gets you out of any responsibility. We want genuine structural reform. We want you to actually change the way in which you negotiate with us. That's what we want, structural reform. And that has to happen. It has to be the first thing that happens. The symbolism that's wrapped around that is a secondary thing. In the 1990s, it was the symbolism that was the primary thing. But it's the structural reform that is the first and most important thing to do now.
Thank you. Next, another question. So there's one here and then one in the front row there. Did you have your hand up before?
Thank you very much for the essay and for this discussion. Is it too cynical altogether to just give up on convincing the politicians? They're obliged to be pragmatic according to the curse of democracy, of the numbers. That response of Turnbull's more or less says there aren't enough Aborigines to affect our decisions, so we're not going to take this recognition issue seriously. We're not going to take the Uluru statement seriously. So can I just, I don't think this is going to get us anywhere, but my inclination is that we need ethical leadership. We can't rely on political leadership because they're bound by their numbers. And so maybe what we have to rely on is the groundswell by prominent other figures, non-political figures, coming in on your side and convincing enough people, enough voters on both sides that it becomes a necessity.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'm more optimistic, I guess. I think that there is a capacity for a coalescence of certain individuals that happens at certain moments in time, certain governments, which we've seen, where you do see evidence of strong ethical leadership. We have seen it, and it will happen again. And you need the outside pressure. That's part of the public thing. We need everything. We need it all that discussion. But there was an extraordinary arrogance in Turnbull's rejection of that statement, which was, I know this won't fly. I know this will fail. How dare he say that? After all of that process of negotiation, to stand there and say, because he's the great, tortured leader of the Republican movement who was crucified, and the nation, what was it? John Howard had sold the... What did Turnbull say Howard had done? Thank you. Broke the nation's heart. Thank you. And therefore, this won't fly. and that was also disingenuous. That wasn't the real reason. It was because they were deeply fearful and scared of what an Indigenous advisory body would mean.
Okay, there's a question down here, and then I'll take one more and we'll close. So I don't know what's happening over this side of the room, but if there's someone over this side of the room, get ready, because I'm ready for you.
Okay. In the essay, you mentioned that you have a quote which says that nearly half the population of Australia is made up of first and second generation Australians, and that nearly 30% of people have been born overseas. Now, you also speculate on what this sort of discussion might mean for these people, whether they understand it at all. I think an important point to remember here is that many of them come from other colonial countries which have been colonized. That might in fact be an advantage. However, my other experience of this is that new migrants are generally very intolerant of later migrants and of the original inhabitants. That's just a personal feeling of mine, based on conversations here and in New Zealand. So my question really is, I'm interested not so much in the process, although that's very important, that's what we've been discussing. I'm interested in how you get the message out more broadly. How do you alter perceptions in addition to having a push from a leader? Now, so in a sense, I'm saying, or asking if you like, do you have any ideas about how this can be brought about?
Ah, yes. Thank you. Thank you. A good point about that is a point that I raise in the essay, talking about Stanner in 1968, talking about the Great Australian Silence when Australia saw itself as predominantly British, and now, 50 years later, of course, nearly 1/3 of the country born overseas. How do recently arrived migrants play into these debates? Do they feel they're implicated? Do they feel engaged? Do they feel as if they're watching from the outside? I guess all of the above, depending, myriad different responses. But it is a question. I'm reminded of myself at age 25 asking Donald Horne the same question on the Republic. And Donald, in his typically sort of gruff, ironic way, said, you just get out and talk. You write, you talk, you pester, you annoy, you just agitate and speak. I wish I had a different plan to change the world. But I think we are. I think that there is more receptiveness to the kinds of things that Tony and I have been discussing and that I've been working through in the essay. I think that after all of this long period of failure, there is a capacity there's a greater willingness to actually work through it and resolve it. So I think it's achievable.
Okay, I'm actually going to leave it there. But to close, I think that it's a really important question in regard to, I think particularly if we're thinking of newly arrived migrants, which began about 240 years ago, it's about knowledge. Just as a sort of, and my friend David over there will remember this from our museum days, and to think about, in some ways, the challenges. I taught Aboriginal history at the University of Melbourne for 5 years, and one of the things that I would talk about is what is called the 1886 Aborigines Act, which is infamously known to us as the Half-Caste Act. It was the piece of legislation initiated in the then colony of Victoria, which became the national foundation for many of the initial so-called Aborigines Acts across the new Commonwealth in the states and territory. When I used to say to university level students in 1886 in this town, a piece of legislation was passed in this parliament which divided my forebears into half-caste, quarter-caste, octoroon, and segmented our families accordingly, and we live with that legacy today, those students would be shocked. And it's quite interesting when you think of migrants. When you talk to migrants about that history, they started to think, okay, so this is why you're Aborigines, rather than you are not Aborigines because you are not a certain colour, knowing how much culture is vital to our identities. And unfortunately, because I did mention I have 5 children and I work at a university, even though we have so-called Indigenous curriculum in the state and private system, it's very piecemeal. And you can still meet young people at university level or meet people on the street who Mark would be wanting to inform, and they have no knowledge of these issues. So you're starting from a very difficult position of a complete absence of knowledge. And when people are faced with those sorts of realities, it's where Stanner's statement, it's where Michael Dodson's statement come back into play. If you confront someone with a past that makes them feel uncomfortable, and then you'll have a Prime Minister in a very shallow way says, well, I can make you feel comfortable again, just ignore this. It's very persuasive. It's the same with, we talked about climate denial. It's very persuasive if you say to people, it's not real, don't you worry about it, don't become engaged. And I think what Mark's essay is trying to do and doing very well is saying, no, we must engage. But if we come to Mark's essay with absolutely no knowledge of the histories that inform the work Mark has done, there's so much catch up to do. And I think this is the other issue that we didn't talk about tonight, but a much more informed education system would get us to a position where we'd be ahead of the game rather than sometimes a long way behind it. Do you want to say anything on that, Mark?
I think I'll let that pass as a comment.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I want to thank everyone for coming along tonight, but obviously more importantly to thank Mark Mckenna for his essay, for his conversation, and I'm sure Mark will be here afterwards to sign copies of the essay and to take your mission statements if you want to send them to him. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony. Thank you. Thank you.